The pen was shaking in my hand, and I hoped no one in that room could see it. My name is Elias Voss, and I was about to sign a document that would either save my species or bury it. Around me stood 12 members of the Vistari delegation, their triple-lidded eyes blinking in that slow, unsettling rhythm they used when they thought they had already won. Behind me stood the last free representatives of Earth, exhausted faces trying to look hopeful after 11 years of war. Nobody in that room except me knew the truth. This treaty was not peace. It was a leash, and we were about to put it around our own necks willingly. The war had cost us everything. Entire colonies turned to ash. Fleets that once numbered in the thousands reduced to a few hundred limping ships. Earth itself had rationed steel and fuel like a nation under siege. Because it was won. The Vistari hegemony had crushed us world by world, not because they were smarter or braver, but because their ships outnumbered ours 10-1, and their weapons had reached a level of power we hadn't matched. When they offered a ceasefire, our leaders wept with relief. I did not weep. I had spent the last 4 months reading intercepted communications that told a very different story. The Vistari delegate across from me was named Threl Ka-Vosh, a name our translators struggled to pronounce correctly. He smiled with his lower mouth, the one used for expressions of satisfaction, while his upper mouth remained closed, the one used for sincerity. Our xenolinguists had studied this species for a decade. A closed upper mouth during a smile meant only one thing: deceit. I smiled back anyway. Ambassador Priya Kapoor stood at my side, her hand resting lightly on the table as if she needed it to remain steady. She was the one who had negotiated the wording of the treaty, clause by painful clause, believing every promise the Vistari made about demilitarized zones and shared technology. She did not know what I knew. Almost no one did. Only 3 people on Earth understood the full shape of what I had been building in secret for the past 6 years, hidden behind classified budgets and false project names, far beyond the edge of our solar system where no scanner from the hegemony had ever reached. Threl Ka-Vosh spoke first, his translated voice smooth and warm through the device clipped to his collar. "Today marks the end of unnecessary suffering," he said. "The hegemony extends its hand in friendship to the people of Earth." I studied his upper mouth. Still closed. "Humanity accepts this treaty in the spirit it is offered," I said, and my voice did not waver even though my hand still did. I chose those words carefully. In the spirit it is offered, not in good faith, not with trust, just in the spirit it was offered, whatever that spirit truly was. The room did not notice the difference. The Vistari did not notice either, or if they did not care, because in their eyes we were already a defeated people signing our own surrender wrapped in polite language. That was exactly what I wanted them to believe. I placed the pen against the parchment and signed my name. The room erupted into quiet applause, the kind of applause exhausted people give when they are too tired to feel real joy, but too desperate not to celebrate something. Cameras flashed. Somewhere on Earth, billions of people were watching this moment through a delayed broadcast, and for them, this was the day the killing finally stopped. For them, hope had a shape now, and that shape was a piece of paper on a table, in orbit above a dying colony world. I kept my eyes on Threl Ka-Vosh as he signed his own copy. His hand did not shake at all. That, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. A species that has just given up something precious hesitates. A species that has just bought itself time does not. After the ceremony, as the delegates filed out and the cameras powered down, Priya caught my arm. "You did it," she said, relief spilling out of her voice. 11 years, and you actually did it. I looked at her, this brilliant woman, who had given everything to bring peace to a dying world, and I could not bring myself to tell her the truth in that moment. Not yet. Not until I had proof strong enough to move an entire planet. "We did it," I said instead, which was not quite a lie, because I had done something too, something she did not know about. That night, alone in my quarters aboard the station, I opened a private channel that did not exist on any official registry. The screen flickered to life, showing a woman with sharp eyes and short gray hair, sitting in a control room that officially did not exist either. "Commander," she said, "congratulations on the treaty." "Don't congratulate me yet, Grace," I said. "Give me the numbers." Grace Whitfield was the only person besides myself and one engineer who knew the full truth about a project buried so deep in classified budgets that even the Earth Defense Council believed it was a decommissioned research station. In reality, it was a shipyard, built in secret over 6 years, in the debris field beyond the outer edge of our solar system, funded by money that officially did not exist, crewed by volunteers who had been quietly removed from public service records and told they would not be able to contact their families for the duration of their service. We called it Ashfall Reserve. 43 ships, Grace said, fully crewed, fully armed, and now that the ceasefire is signed, we finally have breathing room to finish the last of the calibration work on the jump drives. How long until they're combat ready? 4 months. Maybe 5 if the Vastari start watching our shipping lanes more closely. I closed my eyes for a moment. 4 months was not a comfortable number. Every intelligence report I had gathered over the last 4 months suggested the Vastari would not wait much longer than that before breaking the treaty themselves. Their fleet had suffered heavy losses too, more than their public statements ever admitted. They needed time to rebuild, just as much as we did. The difference was that they were rebuilding weapons meant to finish us permanently, while we were building something meant only to survive. "Push it," I said. 3 months. I don't care what it costs. Grace studied me through the screen, her expression unreadable for a long moment. "You think they're going to break it that soon?" "I think," I said slowly, "that Threl Kavosh signed that treaty with a closed mouth." She did not need me to explain what that meant. She had read the same reports I had. "Understood," she said. "I'll push the engineers." The channel closed, and I sat alone in the dark, the glow of the station's running lights the only illumination in the room. Somewhere outside my window, past the thick reinforced glass, the wreckage of 3 human warships still floated in a slow, silent orbit around the station, left there as a permanent reminder of what this war had already cost us. The Vastari had insisted the wreckage remain in place during the negotiations, a symbol, they called it, of the peace we were choosing over further destruction. I understood it differently. It was not a symbol of peace. It was a warning of what would happen if we ever tried to fight back again. I intended to make sure that warning meant nothing. 3 days after the signing, the official broadcasts across Earth showed images of celebration in every major city. Streets filled with people who had spent over a decade rationing food and burying loved ones now dancing under strings of lights that hadn't been lit since the war began. Children who had never known a world without air raid drills were being told the drills were finally over. I watched these broadcasts from my private quarters and felt something twist painfully in my chest, because I knew that somewhere out there, in the cold silence beyond our solar system, a fleet of Vastari engineers were almost certainly doing something very similar to what my own engineers were doing at Ashfall Reserve. Preparing. Ambassador Kapoor requested a meeting with me the following week, official this time, recorded for the Council archives. She wanted to discuss the technology sharing clause of the treaty, one of the provisions she had fought hardest to secure. Under its terms, the Vastari agreed to share limited amounts of their advanced propulsion research with human scientists over the coming years, in exchange for access to certain resource-rich systems along our shared border. "It's a genuine opportunity," she told me, spreading data files across the table between us. "If this holds, we could close the technology gap within a decade." "If it holds," I repeated. She looked up at me sharply. "You still don't trust them." I chose my next words carefully, aware that this meeting was being recorded and would eventually reach eyes far above my own. "I trust the terms of the treaty exactly as much as the Vastari trust them," I said, "which is to say, I trust that both sides will honor it for exactly as long as it benefits them to do so." Priya frowned, but she did not push further. She had known me long enough to understand that when I spoke carefully like that, I was choosing my words for reasons I could not yet explain. After she left, I remained at the table, staring at the resource maps she had left behind. My eyes drifted toward a cluster of systems near the border, 3 small colony worlds that had been placed under what the treaty called joint monitoring. Officially, this meant peacekeeping observers from both sides would maintain a presence there to ensure neither party violated the ceasefire. Unofficially, I already suspected it meant something else entirely. I pulled up the shipping manifests for Vastari vessels moving through that region over the past 3 weeks. The numbers did not add up. Supply ships listed as carrying humanitarian aid were making stops at coordinates with no registered settlements. Fuel consumption rates suggested cargo far heavier than anything described in their official manifests. It was subtle, the kind of inconsistency that would slip past anyone not specifically looking for it. I was specifically looking for it. That night, I sent an encrypted message to 3 trusted analysts, scattered across different departments of Earth's remaining intelligence network, people who had worked with me long before the war began, and whose loyalty I trusted more than I trusted any official chain of command. I asked them each the same question, phrased differently enough that none of them would immediately connect their work to the others. What is really happening in the border systems? I did not sleep well that night. Somewhere beyond the reach of our sensors, I imagined Threl Kavash sitting in a similar room, staring at similar maps, smiling with his lower mouth while his upper mouth remained closed. The peace we had just signed felt less like an ending and more like the held breath before something much larger began. I did not know yet exactly what that something would be or how soon it would arrive, but I knew, with the same certainty that had kept me alive through 11 years of war, that it was coming, and when it came, I intended for humanity to be ready, even if the rest of the galaxy still believed we had nothing left to fight with. The wreckage outside my window drifted slowly past, catching the light of a distant star. I watched it for a long time before finally closing my eyes. Somewhere beyond the dark, Ashfall Reserve was waiting. 6 weeks after the signing, Grace Whitfield called me in the middle of the night, and I knew from the tone of her voice before she even finished speaking that something had gone badly wrong. "We have a problem," she said. "A big one." I sat up immediately, the last traces of sleep vanishing from my mind. "Talk to me. One of the analysts you contacted came back with something. Not just suspicious numbers this time. A person. What kind of person?" "A defector," Grace said. "A Vastari scientist. He crossed through a neutral trading post 2 days ago and requested asylum from a human merchant crew. He's terrified, Elias, and he keeps repeating one word to anyone who will listen: Emberfall." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. "Get him to the station, quietly. I don't want this going through any official channel that might leak." "Already arranged," Grace said. "He'll arrive within 36 hours. I did not sleep again that night. The scientist's name, once translated as closely as our systems could manage, was something like Vethrek Solon. He arrived aboard a modified cargo vessel disguised as a routine supply run, escorted by 2 of Grace's most trusted people, both of whom had been sworn to secrecy under penalties that no longer technically existed in a world at peace, but that I intended to enforce personally if either of them ever spoke a word of this to anyone outside our small circle. I met him in a small, windowless room deep within the non-official sections of the station, the kind of room that did not appear on any building schematic and had no listed purpose. Vethrek Solon looked exhausted in a way that transcended species. His skin, normally a deep blue-gray among his people, had faded to a pale ash color that I later learned was a sign of severe stress among the Vastari. His hands trembled constantly. "You are the human commander," he said through the translation device Grace had provided him, "the one who signed the treaty." "I am," I said. "You wanted to speak with someone in authority. You have me. Tell me what you know." Vethrek Solon closed his eyes for a long moment before he began speaking, and once he started, the words came out in a rush, as though he had been holding them inside for so long that they could no longer be contained. He told me that he had worked for 9 years as a senior researcher within the Hegemony's Advanced Weapons Division, a division whose existence was known only to a small circle within the highest levels of Vastari command. For the last 3 of those years, he had been assigned to a project called Emberfall, a weapons platform designed not to defeat human fleets in battle, but to bypass them entirely. The device, as he described it, used a form of gravitational disruption technology to collapse the structural integrity of planetary crusts from orbit, rendering any world it targeted uninhabitable within hours. It was not a weapon meant for soldiers. It was a weapon meant for populations. The treaty, he said, his voice shaking, was never meant to bring peace. It was meant to buy time. Emberfall was not ready when the war reached its worst point. Your people were losing so quickly that the hegemony leadership believed final victory was close, without needing such a weapon. But then your resistance stiffened. Losses became too costly to continue at the previous pace. The treaty was proposed specifically to halt hostilities long enough to complete the final stages of the project. How long? I asked, my voice carefully leveled despite the storm building inside me. How long until it's ready? I do not know precisely, Vethric Solon admitted. But before I left, the engineering reports suggested completion within 6 to 8 months. Once operational, the plan calls for a surprise strike against 3 of your border colonies, as a demonstration, a message to the rest of your worlds about what continued resistance would bring. I sat in silence for a long moment, processing what I had just heard. Every instinct I had developed over 11 years of war told me this man was telling the truth. The details were too specific, too consistent with the shipping irregularities my analysts had already flagged along the border. This was not fabricated intelligence. This was confirmation of exactly what I had feared since the moment I watched Threl Kavash sign that treaty with a closed upper mouth. "Why did you leave?" I asked him. "Why risk everything to tell us this?" Vethric Solon looked at me with something that might have been the alien equivalent of shame. "I have a daughter," he said quietly. "She is young. I built weapons for years, telling myself they were necessary for our survival, that the war would end and no more of them would be needed. When I learned what Emberfall was truly designed to do, I understood that I was not building something to end a war. I was building something to erase entire populations who could no longer fight back. I could not live with that, not with a daughter of my own who will one day ask me what I did during this time." I studied him for a long moment, this frightened, exhausted man who had crossed an unimaginable distance to warn a species that was, technically, still his enemy. "You'll be protected," I told him. "You have my word." He nodded slowly, though I could see the exhaustion had not left his eyes. Some fears do not simply disappear once the truth is finally spoken aloud. I brought everything to the Earth Defense Council 4 days later. It was, without question, the most difficult presentation of my life. I stood before a room of exhausted, hopeful leaders who had spent the last 6 weeks allowing themselves to believe, for the first time in over a decade, that their children might grow up without air raid sirens. And I had to tell them that hope was built on a lie. Councilman Nathan Pierce, the most vocal supporter of the treaty from the very beginning, rose from his seat before I had even finished speaking. "You're asking us to believe," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "that an enemy who just signed a legally binding peace agreement, an enemy who is currently reducing troop deployments along the border exactly as promised, is secretly building a weapon to destroy us anyway, based on the word of a single defector and some shipping records that could be explained a dozen other ways." "Yes," I said simply, "that is exactly what I am telling you." "Where is your proof, Commander?" "Real proof, not the testimony of a frightened alien who may have his own reasons for wanting to disrupt a peace that many of his own people likely support." It was a fair question, and I had expected it. I nodded to Grace, who stood near the door and activated a secure display at the center of the room. Satellite imagery appeared, showing construction activity at a remote Vastari facility that our intelligence had been tracking for months without fully understanding its purpose. Alongside it, translated fragments of intercepted communications, painstakingly decoded over weeks by cryptography teams who had been told only that this was a matter of highest national security. "This facility," I said, "has expanded its footprint by nearly 300% since the ceasefire began. According to our defector, This matches the location of the primary Emberfall construction site. These communications, while fragmentary, reference a project timeline consistent with what he described. I am not asking you to trust one source alone, Councilman. I am asking you to look at the full picture. The room fell into uneasy silence. Some faces showed the beginning of understanding. Others, like Nathan Pierce, remained skeptical, unwilling to abandon the hope they had only just allowed themselves to feel. "Even if this is true," said Councilwoman Ellen Marsh, her voice quieter but no less firm, "what would you have us do? Our fleets are gutted. We have perhaps 200 combat-ready vessels remaining across our entire territory, most of them outdated compared to Vistari technology. If we abandon the treaty now, based on this evidence, we invite immediate destruction with nothing to defend ourselves." This was the moment I had been preparing for since the day I signed that treaty. I looked around the room at these tired, frightened leaders, people who had spent over a decade making impossible decisions to keep what remained of humanity alive, and I made a choice that I knew could end my career, or worse, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. "We are not as defenseless as our official records suggest," I said. The room went very still. "Explain," Nathan Pierce said slowly. I told them everything, about Ashfall Reserve, hidden beyond the edge of our solar system for 6 years. About the 43 warships built in secret, funded through black budget allocations that had been deliberately obscured from public and even most council oversight. About the crew of volunteers who had given up contact with their families to serve on a fleet that officially did not exist. I explained that I had authorized this project years earlier, under emergency wartime powers that had technically expired the moment the treaty was signed, powers I had continued to use anyway because I believed, with everything in me, that a day like this one would eventually come. When I finished speaking, the silence in the room was heavier than anything I had experienced, even during the darkest days of open war. "You built an entire secret fleet," Councilwoman Marsh said slowly, "without council authorization, using resources that should have gone toward rebuilding our public defenses." "Yes," I said, offering no excuses. "You lied to this council for years." "I withheld information," I said. "I understand the distinction may feel meaningless to you right now. I made that choice because I believed, and still believe, that our survival depended on the Vistari never knowing the full extent of what we still had left to fight with. If Ashfall Reserve had been public knowledge, it would have been discovered. If it had been discovered, we would not be having this conversation, because there would be no fleet left to discuss." Nathan Pierce stared at me with an expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. "And now you're telling us this fleet isn't even finished, that it needs months more before it's combat ready, months we may not have if this defector's timeline is accurate." "I am telling you," I said, "that we have a choice to make. We can continue pretending this treaty is real while a weapon capable of destroying entire populations reaches completion, or we can accelerate our preparations, quietly, and be ready when the moment comes that the Vistari inevitably show their true intentions. Because, Councilman, I promise you, that moment is coming. The only question is whether we face it armed or unarmed." The debate that followed lasted nearly 6 hours. I will not recount every argument, every accusation, every moment where I thought the entire council might simply have me removed from my position and my clearance revoked entirely. But by the end of that impossibly long day, a narrow majority voted to authorize emergency funding to complete Ashfall Reserve ahead of schedule, under the strictest possible secrecy, with oversight limited to a small group of council members who had proven, over many years, that they could be trusted to keep a secret that might determine the survival of our entire species. Nathan Pierce voted against it, still unwilling to abandon the hope of a genuine peace. I understood his position, even as I disagreed with it completely. Hope is not a weakness, but hope alone has never won a war, and I was no longer willing to gamble everything we had left on the goodwill of an enemy who had shown us, again and again, exactly what they were capable of. That night, I stood once again at the observation window of my quarters, watching the wreckage of those 3 human warships drift silently past, illuminated faintly by distant starlight. Somewhere beyond the edge of our solar system, 43 ships were now being pushed toward completion at a pace that would exhaust every engineer working on the project. Somewhere far beyond that, in a facility whose location we now understood far better than before, a weapon designed to erase entire populations was quietly nearing completion of its own. I did not know exactly when the Vistari would break their treaty, but I knew now, with absolute certainty, that they would. And when they did, humanity would not be caught defenseless again. Vethrek Solon remained aboard the station under careful protection, his warning already changing the course of everything that would follow. I visited him once more before the events that came next, finding him sitting quietly in the small room that had become his temporary home. "Your daughter," I said. "What is her name?" He looked up at me, surprised by the question. "Mira," he said softly. "Her name is Mira." "When this is over," I told him, "I hope you get to see her again." He did not answer, but something in his expression shifted, just slightly, towards something that might have been hope. I left him there and returned to my quarters, knowing that the quiet weeks of preparation were nearly finished, and that whatever came next would test everything we had built in the shadows. The alert came at 4 in the morning, station time, and it did not sound like a drill. I was already awake when it happened, sitting at my desk reviewing engineering reports from Ashfall Reserve, when every screen in my quarters suddenly switched to a flashing crimson border, and a voice I had heard only during the darkest days of the old war began speaking through the station's emergency channel. Unidentified vessels detected entering the Halvorn colony system, weapons signatures consistent with Vistari military hardware. This is not a drill. My blood turned to ice. The Halvorn system was one of 3 colony worlds placed under what the treaty called joint monitoring, exactly the region where my analysts had first noticed the irregular shipping patterns months earlier. I was moving before I had even fully processed what I was hearing, pulling on my uniform as I opened a direct channel to Grace Whitfield. "Tell me you're seeing this," I said the moment her face appeared on screen. "I'm seeing it," she said, her voice tight. 12 Vistari warships, full combat configuration, dropped out of slipspace directly above Halvorn Colony less than 10 minutes ago. They're not responding to any hailing attempts. Casualties. Unknown so far. Colony defenses are minimal, you know that. The treaty required us to reduce garrison strength there to almost nothing. We have maybe 200 colonial militia, and no orbital defense platforms worth mentioning. I closed my eyes for a single, terrible moment. 200 militia against 12 warships was not a battle, it was a formality before a massacre. "Get me the council," I said. "Now." The emergency session convened within 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. Councilwoman Ellen Marsh looked as though she had aged a decade since I had last seen her. Nathan Pierce, for once, said nothing at all, his face pale as the reports continued streaming in from Halvorn. "They're calling it an inspection," said Priya Kapoor, reading from an official Vistari communication that had just arrived through diplomatic channels. "They claim intelligence suggested humanity was secretly rearming in violation of the treaty, and they are conducting a, quote, routine verification of compliance, unquote." "That's a lie," I said. "There is nothing routine about 12 warships in full combat configuration." "I know that," Priya snapped, her composure finally cracking after weeks of mounting tension. "I know that, Elias. But we have no fleet in position to respond. Everything close enough to reach Halvorn in time is exactly what the treaty required us to reduce. This is exactly what you tried to warn us about, and we still weren't ready." She was not wrong, and the truth of it sat heavy in my chest. Ashfall Reserve, even with accelerated construction, remained weeks away from full combat readiness. The 43 ships hidden beyond our solar system could not reach Halvorn in time to prevent whatever was about to happen there. For the first time since I had begun this secret project years earlier, I felt the full weight of a terrible possibility. That I had built our hidden strength too slowly, and people were now going to pay the price for that delay. Reports continued arriving throughout the following hours, each one worse than the last. The Vistari ships had begun what they called a search operation, deploying troops onto the colony surface under the pretense of verifying compliance with the treaty's disarmament clauses. Colonial militia, following strict orders not to provoke conflict, stood aside as armed Vistari soldiers moved through settlements, entering homes, seizing communication equipment, detaining local officials for what was described only as questioning. It was not yet violence in the way the old war had defined violence. No weapons had been fired. No lives had been lost, at least not according to the reports reaching us. But it was something almost worse in its own way, a slow, deliberate demonstration of power designed to remind an entire colony, and through them an entire species, exactly how little our supposed peace was actually worth. I watched the reports come in with a strange, cold clarity settling over me. This was not yet the strike Vethrek Solon had warned us about. Emberfall was still months from completion by his own estimate. This was something else, a probe, a test, perhaps even a deliberate provocation designed to see how humanity would respond before the Vastari committed to their final plan. "They're testing us," I said aloud, more to myself than to anyone else in the room. Ellen Marsh looked at me sharply. "What do you mean?" "They want to see if we push back," I said. "If we respond with force, even limited force, it gives them justification to escalate immediately, to claim we violated the treaty first. If we do nothing, it confirms exactly what they likely already believe, that we remain too weak and too desperate for peace to risk any real resistance." "So what do we do?" Nathan Pierce asked, his earlier confidence in the treaty now visibly shattered. I thought carefully before answering, weighing every possibility against everything I had learned over the previous weeks. "We do nothing that gives them justification," I said slowly. "We lodge the strongest possible diplomatic protest through official channels. We demand immediate withdrawal. We document everything, every violation, every moment of this so-called inspection for the record. And we let them believe, for just a little longer, that we have no way to respond beyond words." "That's it," Priya said, disbelief coloring her voice. "We just let them do this." "For now," I said, and the words tasted bitter even as I spoke them, "because the alternative is committing an unfinished fleet to a fight it cannot win, and losing the one advantage we have left: surprise." It was, without question, one of the hardest decisions of my life. Watching reports of Vistari soldiers moving freely through a human colony, detaining officials, seizing property, all while I ordered restraint, felt like a betrayal of everything I had spent years preparing to prevent. But I had learned, across 11 brutal years of war, that the difference between a costly victory and a permanent defeat often came down to patience at exactly the moment when patience felt impossible. The occupation of Halvorn lasted 6 days. Vastari forces eventually withdrew, having found, unsurprisingly, no evidence of the rearmament they claimed to be investigating, because no such rearmament had ever existed at Halvorn itself. They issued a brief statement expressing satisfaction with humanity's continued compliance with the treaty, framing the entire incident as a routine and successful verification process. Not a single word of apology was offered for the disruption, the fear, or the violation of a colony's basic dignity. I read that statement 3 times, sitting alone in my quarters, my hands clenched so tightly around the datapad that my knuckles had gone white. "They wanted to see if we would break first," I said to Grace during our next secure call. "And we didn't. That buys us time. Maybe not much, but some." "How much time do we actually need?" Grace asked. "How close is Ashfall to combat readiness?" She checked something off-screen before answering. 7 weeks, if we push the engineers to their absolute limit. 5 weeks for a partial deployment, though I wouldn't recommend committing an incomplete fleet against a full Vistari battle group. "Push for 7, I said. "And Grace, I need something else from you." "Name it." "I need eyes on that Emberfall facility. Real time, if possible. If they move that weapon toward completion faster than Vethrek Solon's estimate, I need to know the moment it happens." Grace nodded, already making notes. "I'll see what we can arrange. It won't be easy, That facility is deep inside Vostari territory, far beyond anywhere our current reconnaissance assets can safely operate. Find a way, I said, whatever it costs. Over the following weeks, a strange, tense quiet settled across human and Vostari territory alike. Official communications continued, as though nothing unusual had occurred at Halvorn. Trade negotiations proceeded under the treaty's technology-sharing provisions, with small amounts of Vostari propulsion research beginning to flow toward human scientific institutions, just enough to maintain the illusion of a treaty being honored in good faith. I did not trust a single moment of it. Vethrek Solon remained aboard the station throughout this period, his information proving more valuable with each passing week, as our own intelligence gathering slowly confirmed detail after detail of what he had told us. He asked me once, during a rare quiet visit, whether I believed his warning had made any real difference. "You gave us time we would not otherwise have had," I told him honestly. Whether that time proves enough remains to be seen. He nodded slowly, his ash-colored skin having regained some of its natural deeper hue over the weeks of relative safety aboard the station. "I think often of what would have happened if I had stayed silent," he said. "I think of my daughter, growing up in a galaxy where I said nothing while such a weapon was completed." "You didn't stay silent," I reminded him. "That matters more than you know." 5 weeks after the Halvorn incident, Grace's reconnaissance efforts finally paid off. A modified sensor drone, disguised as harmless debris and drifting on a carefully calculated trajectory, managed to capture a brief but unmistakable image of the Emberfall facility from a distance close enough to reveal critical details. The weapon platform, larger than any of us had anticipated, showed clear signs of near completion. Structural framework fully assembled, power conduits already active and drawing enormous amounts of energy. Vethrek Solon, when shown the imagery, went very still. "This is further along than I believed possible," he said quietly. "When I left, this level of completion was still months away." "How long now?" I asked, dreading the answer. He studied the image carefully, his trembling hands hovering over the display. "Weeks," he finally said. "Perhaps less." The quiet, careful patience I had maintained since Halvorn evaporated in an instant. I contacted Grace immediately. "How close is Ashfall to full readiness?" 6 days from full combat certification, she said. We were ahead of the original 7-week estimate. 6 days may not be enough, I said, more to myself than to her. Push everything. I don't care what corners need cutting on non-essential systems. Weapons, shields, and jump drives need to be fully operational. Everything else can wait. Understood, Grace said, and I could hear in her voice that she understood exactly what I was not saying aloud, that whatever time remained before the Vostari activated their weapon, we might not have enough of it left to prevent what was coming. I stood once more at my observation window that night, watching the drifting wreckage of the old war, and for the first time since signing that treaty, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of fear I had been holding back for months. Not fear for myself, fear for every colony, every family, every child who had spent the last few months believing, however briefly, that the killing had truly stopped. Somewhere beyond the reach of our sensors, a weapon capable of erasing populations was nearing completion. Somewhere beyond the edge of our own solar system, 43 ships were racing toward readiness with a speed that pushed every engineer and crew member past the edge of exhaustion. The peace, such as it had ever truly been, was about to end. And this time, when it did, humanity would not be caught standing empty-handed. The attack came on the 6th day, exactly when Grace had warned it might, and it came without any of the careful pretense the Vostari had used at Halvorn. 3 colonies along the border, Halvorn among them again, along with Corin's Reach and the mining settlement of Dunmar Station, were struck simultaneously by Vostari battle groups that dropped out of slipspace with no warning and no diplomatic communication whatsoever. This was not an inspection. This was not a search for treaty violations. Weapons fired within minutes of arrival, striking colonial defense installations, communication arrays, and, most horrifically, civilian infrastructure that had no military value whatsoever. I received the first reports while standing in the command center Grace had quietly established aboard the station months earlier, disguised as an unused maintenance section. The images coming through were the worst I had seen in the entire 11 years of war. Colonial militia, hopelessly outmatched, attempting to organize a defense against forces they had no realistic chance of repelling. Evacuation ships, struggling to lift off from settlements under active bombardment. Voices on the emergency channels, some calm and professional, others raw with fear, all of them asking the same desperate question: where is our fleet? Why is no one coming to help us? I felt every one of those voices like a physical blow, because I knew the answer, and the answer was almost unbearable. Our fleet was coming. It simply was not close enough yet. "Talk to me, Grace," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "HFY completed final certification 4 hours ago," she said, working furiously at her console. "The fleet is ready. Jump calculations are already underway to bring them to the border region." "How long?" 18 minutes until jump completion, assuming no complications. 18 minutes felt like an eternity while colonies burned, but I had learned, across years of preparation, that arriving too early carried its own terrible risk. The Vistari battle groups currently engaged in this attack believed, with complete confidence, that humanity had nothing left capable of meaningful resistance. That confidence, born from years of watching us retreat and finally surrender to a treaty, was about to become their greatest weakness. "Hold the jump calculation steady," I said. "I want HFY arriving directly behind their main formation, not in front of it. I want them fully committed to this attack, fully confident, before they realize anything has changed." Priya Kapoor's voice came through on a separate channel, distraught in a way I had rarely heard from her throughout the entire war. "Elias, people are dying down there. Why are we waiting?" "Because if we arrive too soon, with a fleet that outnumbers what we've shown them, but is still smaller than their reserve forces, they may simply retreat and regroup, and we lose the only chance we will ever have to cripple their capability to do this again," I said. "I know what I'm asking. I know the cost of every additional minute. But this has to work completely, or it accomplishes nothing beyond delaying the next attack." The 18 minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I watched reports continue streaming in from the 3 besieged colonies, forcing myself to absorb every detail even as it became harder and harder to maintain the composed exterior my position required. Dunmar Station's main communication array went silent 9 minutes into the attack. Corin's Reach reported their evacuation efforts were proceeding, though slower than needed given the intensity of the bombardment overhead. Halvorn, having endured the earlier occupation months before, seemed to have learned enough from that experience to organize a more effective evacuation, though their militia commander's voice, relayed through emergency channels, carried an exhaustion that spoke to how desperately close to breaking they truly were. At the 17-minute mark, Grace's voice cut through the tension in the command center. "Jump calculation complete. HFY Reserve is ready on your order." I closed my eyes for one final moment, thinking of Vethrek Solon and his daughter, thinking of the militia commander at Halvorn who had already endured this cruelty once before, thinking of every family currently huddled in evacuation shelters praying for a rescue that had felt, until this exact moment, like it would never come. "Send them," I said, "all 43 ships, full engagement." What followed was unlike anything I had witnessed during the entire 11 years of open war. 43 human warships, built in complete secrecy, crewed by volunteers who had sacrificed years of contact with their own families for exactly this moment, emerged from slipspace directly behind the Vistari formations engaged at all 3 colonies simultaneously. The element of surprise was absolute. Vistari sensor operators, fully focused on an assault they believed faced no meaningful resistance, had no warning whatsoever before human weapons fire began tearing through their rear formations. I watched the tactical display in the command center with a strange, detached focus, the kind of clarity that only comes from years of training taking over where raw emotion would otherwise overwhelm rational thought. Ashfall's ships, though fewer in number than the combined Vistari battle groups, possessed technology that our enemy had no reason to expect. Jump drives calibrated for precision strikes rather than large-scale fleet movement, allowing our vessels to appear at exact tactical positions rather than general staging areas. Rail weapons reverse-engineered over years from captured Vistari wreckage, delivering damage output that matched or exceeded anything the hegemony fleet carried. Most importantly, shields modified using data quietly extracted from the treaty's own technology-sharing provisions. The very agreements the Vistari had offered, in a gesture of supposed goodwill, now being used to protect the fleet they never believed existed. The battle at Halvorn turned first. Caught completely off guard, 3 Vistari warships were disabled within the opening minutes of engagement, their commanders apparently unable to process how a defenseless species had suddenly produced a combat-capable fleet from seemingly nowhere. The remaining Vistari vessels attempted to regroup, but the confusion had already cost them the tactical advantage they had held only moments before. At Corin's Reach, the fighting proved more difficult. The Vistari commander there, whether through better training or simple luck, recognized the threat more quickly and organized a defensive formation before Ashfall's ships could fully press their advantage. For nearly 40 minutes, the battle hung in careful balance, human vessels trading heavy fire with a Vistari force, determined not to retreat without inflicting significant damage first. It was Dunmar Station's engagement that proved most costly. The mining settlement's minimal defenses had already been overwhelmed before Ashfall's arrival, and the fleet commander there, a woman named Charlotte Renner, who I had personally selected for this command years earlier, specifically for her steady judgment under pressure, made the difficult call to prioritize protecting the remaining evacuation ships over immediately engaging the full Vistari formation. It was the correct decision, saving hundreds of civilian lives that would otherwise have been lost, but it came at a cost. 2 of Ashfall's ships sustained critical damage protecting those evacuation vessels, and 11 crew members aboard those 2 ships did not survive the engagement. I received word of those losses while the battle was still ongoing at the other 2 colonies, and I felt the weight of each name settle onto my shoulders with a heaviness that no amount of tactical necessity could ever fully justify. By the time the fighting finally ended, roughly 2 hours after Ashfall's arrival, the results told a story that would reshape the entire balance of power between our 2 species. Of the Vistari battle groups that had launched this surprise attack, more than half their vessels were destroyed or disabled beyond immediate repair. The remainder retreated in disorganized haste, their commanders apparently unwilling to risk further losses against a human fleet whose true capabilities they had catastrophically underestimated. Human losses, while far smaller in comparison, were not without weight. 3 ships lost entirely, 11 crew members killed at Dunmar Station, along with 4 more lost during the fighting at Corin's Reach. Every single one of those names would eventually be read aloud during a memorial ceremony that I insisted on attending personally, despite advice from several council members that my presence there, given the secrecy surrounding Ashfall Reserve, might raise uncomfortable questions before I was ready to answer them. I attended anyway. I owed them that much, and far more besides. The political aftermath of the battle proved almost as difficult as the fighting itself. Word of Ashfall Reserve's existence could no longer remain contained to a small circle of council members once 43 warships had appeared in open combat before witnesses across 3 different colony systems. Within days, the story had spread across every human world, sparking a complicated mixture of celebration and outrage that played out simultaneously across public broadcasts and closed-door council sessions alike. Nathan Pierce, who had voted against accelerating Ashfall's completion just months earlier, called for a formal inquiry into my conduct, arguing that I had operated a secret military fleet without proper oversight for years, using funds diverted from public reconstruction efforts, all while the Council and the public believed humanity had genuinely disarmed under the treaty's terms. I did not fight the inquiry. I welcomed it, in truth, because I believed then, and still believe now, that the people I served deserved a full and honest accounting of every decision I had made in their name, even the ones that had required deception to protect them. The inquiry convened 3 weeks after the battle, in a chamber packed with council members, military officials, and journalists granted rare access to what had become the most significant political proceeding since the original treaty negotiations. I stood before them without notes, without prepared statements, because I wanted every answer I gave to come directly and honestly, without the polish of careful political language. "You are accused," said the presiding officer, a stern woman named Susan Whitcomb, who had served on the council since before the war began, of maintaining an unauthorized military fleet for over 6 years, of diverting public funds through fraudulent budget allocations, and of withholding critical strategic information from this council and from the people of Earth. How do you answer these accusations? "I don't deny any of them," I said simply. "Every accusation you've listed is accurate. I built Ashfall Reserve in secret. I diverted funds without proper authorization. I withheld information about its existence from this council for years, and from the public entirely, right up until the moment its ships appeared to defend 3 colonies from an attack that this same council was told, by the very enemy we had just signed a treaty with, would never come." A murmur passed through the chamber at my directness, but I continued before anyone could interrupt. I did not do these things because I sought power, or because I doubted the good intentions of this council or the people of Earth. I did them because I understood something that took this council months, and a devastating attack to finally accept, that a species willing to negotiate a treaty in bad faith cannot be trusted to honor that treaty simply because ink has dried on a page. I believed, and events have now proven, that our survival depended on maintaining a capability our enemy did not know existed. If I had sought proper authorization through official channels years ago, the very existence of that request would have created a paper trail, a vulnerability, a chance for discovery that could have compromised everything before it was ever completed. I made the choice to accept full personal responsibility for that risk, rather than share it with a council that, however capable, could not guarantee the level of secrecy this project required. "And if you had been wrong," Susan Whitcomb asked, her voice carrying the weight of genuine inquiry rather than simple accusation. "If the Vistari had honored the treaty and your secret fleet had eventually been discovered, don't you understand what that would have meant? It could have shattered any chance of genuine peace between our species, potentially reigniting the very war that treaty was meant to end. It was, I admitted to myself, the single hardest question anyone asked me during that entire proceeding, because it forced me to confront a possibility I had wrestled with privately for years without ever fully resolving. "I have thought about that exact scenario more times than I can count," I said honestly, "and I do not have a perfect answer for you, councilwoman. What I can tell you is this. Every piece of intelligence I gathered over those 6 years, every irregular shipping pattern, every intercepted communication, every instinct built from 11 years of studying an enemy who had shown us again and again exactly what they were willing to do to achieve victory, told me that the risk of trusting blindly was far greater than the risk of preparing quietly. I was prepared to be wrong. I built Ashfall Reserve knowing there was a chance it would never be needed, that its existence might one day require nothing more than a quiet decommissioning and an apology to this council for the resources spent unnecessarily. I accepted that risk because the alternative, being unprepared if my fears proved accurate, was a risk I was never willing to accept on behalf of people who trusted this council to protect them. The inquiry continued for 3 more days, examining every detail of Ashfall's construction, funding, and operational history with a thoroughness that left little room for anything to remain hidden. By its conclusion, the council's final judgment, delivered by a narrow but decisive majority, found that while my methods had violated numerous protocols and oversight requirements, my actions had ultimately preserved lives that would otherwise have been lost, and that the extraordinary circumstances of a treaty signed in demonstrable bad faith justified extraordinary measures taken in response. I was not removed from my position, though I understood clearly that many who voted in my favor did so with significant reservations about the precedent being set. Nathan Pierce, still unconvinced that the ends justified the means I had used, resigned from his counsel seat shortly after the inquiry concluded, stating publicly that he could no longer serve alongside colleagues willing to overlook such fundamental breaches of trust, regardless of the outcome they had produced. I respected his decision, even as I disagreed with it. Not every difficult choice earns universal agreement, and I had long ago accepted that leading through moments like these would cost me relationships and respect I might otherwise have kept, had I chosen a safer, quieter path instead. Vethric Solan watched the entire inquiry from aboard the station, his asylum status now a matter of public record given everything that had come to light. When I visited him after the proceedings concluded, he studied me with an expression I had come to recognize as genuine concern. "They nearly removed you from command," he said, "for telling the truth about what you did to protect them." "They nearly did," I agreed, "but they didn't, and that matters more than the nearly." "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "The deception, the years of secrecy, even now, knowing what it cost." I considered the question carefully before answering, thinking of the 11 names read aloud at that memorial ceremony, of Charlotte Renner's difficult choice at Dunmar Station, of every year Grace and her crew had spent building a fleet in complete isolation from everyone they loved. "I regret that it was ever necessary," I said finally. "I do not regret that I was prepared when it became necessary anyway." Vethric Solan nodded slowly, understanding perhaps better than anyone else aboard that station exactly what such a distinction meant. Beyond our borders, the shattered remains of the Vastari attack fleet had limped back toward hegemony territory, carrying with them news that would reshape every calculation their leadership had made about humanity's true capabilities. The treaty, for all practical purposes, now lay in ruins, its careful language exposed as nothing more than a temporary shield the Vastari had used to buy time for a weapon that remained, as far as our intelligence could confirm, still unfinished. I understood, standing once more at my observation window that night, that the war was not truly over. It had simply entered a new phase, one where both sides now understood exactly what the other was capable of, and where any future peace would need to be built on something far sturdier than polite words and closed-mouthed smiles. Somewhere beyond the reach of our sensors, Threl Kavash was likely receiving the same reports I had already studied in exhaustive detail. I wondered, briefly, whether his mouths remained closed even now, in the privacy of whatever chamber he occupied, or whether the shock of what had happened had finally forced something like honesty to the surface. I did not know, but I intended to find out soon, because the next conversation between our two species would not take place across a negotiating table designed by Vastari diplomats. It would take place on terms that humanity, for the first time in this entire war, had finally earned the right to set. 3 months after the battle at Halvorn, Corin's Reach, and Dunmar Station, I stood once again aboard a station in orbit, waiting for a delegation of Vastari representatives to arrive for negotiations that would determine what shape the future relationship between our two species would finally take. This time, everything was different. Ashfall Reserve no longer hid in secrecy beyond the edge of our solar system. Its ships, now openly acknowledged as part of humanity's official defense fleet, had spent the previous months conducting patrols along every contested border system, a visible reminder to any Vastari commander who might have considered testing our resolve again that the days of humanity appearing defenseless were permanently behind us. Grace Whitfield now held an official command position overseeing continued expansion of our fleet capabilities, her years of secret work finally recognized publicly rather than hidden away in classified budget lines that officially did not exist. The intelligence gathered from the destroyed and disabled Vastari vessels during the battle had also proven invaluable beyond simply confirming Vethric Solan's warnings. Salvage teams recovered partial schematics related to the Emberfall project from the memory cores of 2 disabled command ships, providing our scientists with enough information to develop countermeasures against the gravitational disruption technology at the heart of the weapon's design. It would not render the threat entirely obsolete, but it meant that any future attempt to deploy such a device against our worlds would face resistance far more sophisticated than anything the Vistari might have anticipated when they first began construction. Most significantly, the political situation within the Vistari hegemony itself had shifted dramatically following their defeat. Internal communications intercepted in the weeks after the battle suggested significant disagreement among their leadership about the wisdom of the surprise attack, with several prominent voices arguing that the entire strategy had catastrophically underestimated human capability and had needlessly reignited a war their own people, exhausted after 11 years of fighting, had little appetite to continue. Threl Kavash, I later learned, had been the primary architect of both the original treaty deception and the subsequent attack, and his standing within the hegemony's command structure had suffered considerably as a result of its failure. It was therefore not entirely surprising when the delegation that arrived for this new round of negotiations included several unfamiliar faces alongside Threl Kavash himself, representatives whose presence suggested that even within Vistari leadership, questions were being asked about whether continued conflict truly served their species' long-term interests. I met them in the same conference room where the original treaty had been signed, though the atmosphere this time carried none of the false warmth that had characterized that earlier meeting. Priya Kapoor stood at my side once more, though her presence at these negotiations now came with a hard-earned understanding of exactly how far Vistari promises could actually be trusted. Threl Kavash's upper mouth remained closed as he greeted us, a detail I noted immediately and did not allow myself to forget for even a moment throughout the proceedings that followed. "Commander Voss," he said through the translation device, "it seems your species possessed resources beyond what our intelligence had assessed. It seems your species possessed intentions beyond what your treaty had promised," I replied evenly. A tense silence settled over the room before one of the newer delegation members, a Vistari representative whose name translated roughly to Karsh Anduvel, spoke for the first time. "The events of recent months have caused significant reconsideration within our leadership," she said, her translated voice notably different in tone from Threl Kavash's practiced diplomatic smoothness. "I will speak plainly, Commander, because I believe plain speaking is what these negotiations require if any lasting resolution is to be achieved. The attack ordered against your border colonies was authorized without full consensus among hegemony leadership, and its catastrophic failure has created substantial internal division about the wisdom of continuing hostilities against a species that has now demonstrated capabilities we did not previously believe existed." I studied her carefully, weighing the sincerity of her words against everything I had learned about reading Vistari expressions over the years. Her upper mouth, unlike Threl Kavash's, remained open throughout her statement. "I appreciate your honesty," I said carefully, "though I hope you understand why that honesty alone is not sufficient grounds for humanity to simply trust that this attempt at peace will prove any more genuine than the last one." "I understand completely," Karsh Anduvel said, "which is why I believe any agreement reached here must include provisions that do not rely solely on trust between our leadership, but on verifiable mechanisms that would make future deception significantly more difficult to conceal." This was, I recognized immediately, an opening far more substantial than anything the previous negotiations had offered, and I intended to use it fully. Over the following days, the negotiations that produced what would eventually become known as the Halvorn Accords bore little resemblance to the polite, carefully worded treaty I had signed months earlier. Every provision was scrutinized, debated, and reinforced with verification mechanisms designed specifically to prevent the kind of deception that had nearly cost humanity everything. Where the original treaty had relied on Vistari self-reporting for compliance with disarmament clauses, the new agreement established a permanent joint inspection framework, with human observers granted genuine access to Vistari military facilities, not merely the sanitized tours previously offered, alongside reciprocal access granted to Vistari observers at human installations. Where the original treaty had positioned border colonies under vague joint monitoring arrangements that had proven catastrophically easy to exploit, The new agreement established clearly defined defensive garrisons, staffed by human forces with explicit authority to respond to any unauthorized military incursion, removing the ambiguity that had left Halvorn so vulnerable during that earlier occupation. Perhaps most significantly, the technology-sharing provisions were restructured entirely. Rather than a one-directional flow of limited Viestari research offered as a gesture that had ultimately served primarily to obscure their true intentions, the new framework established genuine mutual exchange, verified by independent scientific teams from both species, with severe and clearly defined consequences for any party found withholding agreed-upon information. Threl Kavash objected repeatedly throughout these negotiations, arguing that such extensive verification measures represented an unacceptable violation of Vistari sovereignty, a position that grew increasingly difficult for him to maintain as more of his own delegation, led increasingly by Karsh Onduvel's more pragmatic influence, expressed willingness to accept terms he considered excessive. On the fourth day of negotiations, during a private recess, Karsh Anduvel approached me alone, away from the formal proceedings and the presence of her own delegation. "You must understand something, Commander," she said quietly. "Threl Kavash does not represent the full will of hegemony leadership, even now. There are those among us who genuinely wish for lasting peace between our species, who recognize that continued conflict serves no one, least of all the countless lives already lost across 11 years of unnecessary war. But there are also those who still believe humanity remains fundamentally weaker than us, and who view any agreement granting you equal standing as an unacceptable concession rather than a genuine path toward coexistence. And which group do you believe will ultimately determine how this treaty is honored?" I asked. She considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not know with certainty," she admitted. "What I can tell you is that the failure of the recent attack has strengthened the position of those who favor genuine peace considerably. Losses of that magnitude are not easily dismissed within our command structure, regardless of how those who ordered the attack might wish to frame the outcome publicly." "Then I suppose," I said, "the verification mechanisms we've spent these past days negotiating will matter more than either of us can currently predict." "I suppose they will," she agreed. The final agreement was signed 9 days after negotiations began, in a ceremony that carried none of the false celebration that had marked the original treaty's signing. There was no applause when the final signatures were completed, no cameras capturing images of hopeful crowds gathering across Earth's cities. Instead, there was something I found far more valuable, a quiet, sober acknowledgement from leaders on both sides that this agreement would need to be maintained through continued vigilance rather than blind faith, that lasting peace between our species would require ongoing effort rather than a single moment of relief. Threl Kavash signed the final document with his upper mouth closed, exactly as he had the first time. I noted it, as I always did, but this time it did not concern me the way it once had, because this agreement no longer depended on his sincerity alone. It depended on mechanisms designed specifically to function regardless of whether every individual involved genuinely wished for peace. Mechanisms built from the hard lessons of a treaty that had nearly cost humanity everything. After the signing, I made a decision that surprised even myself, one I had been considering for weeks without fully committing to it until that exact moment. I requested a private meeting with Vethrek Solan, who had remained aboard the station throughout the entire negotiation process, his continued presence a quiet reminder of everything his courage had made possible. "The hegemony's new leadership has agreed to a provision I insisted upon during the final days of negotiation," I told him. "Full amnesty for any Vostari citizen who provided intelligence to human authorities during the period of hostilities, including safe passage for any family members who wished to join them." Vethrek Solan stared at me, his ash-colored skin flushing back to its natural deep blue as understanding settled over him. "Mira," he whispered, "you mean my daughter could—" "She can join you, if that is what you both wish," I said. "Grace has already begun coordinating the arrangements. It will take some time, given the diplomatic complexity involved, but it will happen." For the first time since I had met him, Months earlier, in that small windowless room, Vethrek Solon wept openly, the careful composure he had maintained throughout so many difficult conversations finally giving way to something rawer and more honest. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "I did not expect, after everything, I did not expect kindness to be part of what followed. You gave humanity a chance we might not otherwise have had," I told him. "This is a small measure of what that chance was worth." In the months that followed the signing of the Halvorn Accords, the fragile peace between our species slowly, carefully began to solidify into something more substantial than the hollow agreement that had preceded it. Joint inspection teams conducted their first verified visits without incident, each successful exchange building a small measure of confidence that had been entirely absent from the previous treaty's brief existence. Border garrisons, now staffed with clear defensive authority, maintained a watchful peace along the contested systems that had once proven so vulnerable to exploitation. Threl Kavash's influence within hegemony leadership continued to diminish over subsequent months, as reports of his role in orchestrating both the original deception and the subsequent failed attack became more widely known among Vistari citizens, increasingly weary of a war that had cost them as dearly as it had cost us. Karsh Anduvel, by contrast, rose to a position of significant authority within her species' governing structure, becoming, in many ways, the counterpart on their side to the role I had come to occupy on ours, a leader committed to ensuring that whatever peace existed between our species would be built on substance rather than convenient fiction. I remained in my position throughout this transition, though the nature of my responsibilities shifted considerably from the desperate secrecy that had defined the years spent building Ashfall Reserve. Where I had once operated in shadows, hiding an entire fleet from public knowledge, I now worked openly to integrate that fleet into humanity's broader defense structure, training new generations of officers in the hard lessons learned from 11 years of war, followed by a treaty that had nearly cost us everything through blind trust. Grace Whitfield eventually stepped back from active fleet command, choosing instead to focus on developing the next generation of technology that would ensure humanity never again found itself as vulnerable as we had been during those early years of the original war. Charlotte Renner, whose difficult decisions at Dunmar Station had saved countless lives at significant cost, received a promotion to oversee the newly established Joint Inspection Program, her steady judgment proving as valuable in diplomatic verification work as it had once been in the chaos of battle. Vethrek Solon's daughter arrived aboard the station 8 months after the Halvorn Accords were signed, and I made a point of being present for their reunion, watching from a respectful distance as a frightened, exhausted father who had risked everything to warn a species not his own finally held his child again after months of uncertain separation. It remains, even now, one of the moments from that entire chapter of my life that I remember most clearly, a small, quiet reminder that even amid the largest, most consequential decisions a leader must make, the true measure of what those decisions accomplish is often found in moments like that one, small, personal, and profoundly human. I stood once more at my observation window on the evening marking the first full year since the Halvorn Accords had been signed, watching the same drifting wreckage that had witnessed both the original false treaty and the desperate battle that followed its betrayal. The debris remained in place still, left as a permanent memorial to everything that conflict had cost both our species, a reminder I had come to value rather than resent, because forgetting the price of complacency seemed, to me, a far greater danger than remembering it clearly. The peace we now maintained was not perfect. It required constant vigilance, ongoing verification, ongoing effort from leaders, on both sides who understood that trust, once broken, could not simply be restored through polite words and careful diplomatic language. But it was real, in a way the original treaty had never been, built not on the false hope of an enemy's goodwill, but on the hard-earned understanding that lasting peace required both sides to remain genuinely capable of enforcing the terms they agreed to. I had signed that first treaty knowing it was a deception, and I had prepared for that deception in secret because I understood, Even then, that survival required more than hope alone. What I had not fully understood, until everything that followed, was that true peace would require something more than mere strength as well. It would require the courage to extend trust carefully, verify it constantly, and remain honest, even when honesty proved difficult, about exactly what it would take to maintain something as fragile and valuable as a peace between two species who had spent over a decade trying to destroy one another. Somewhere beyond my window, the stars continued their slow, patient turning, indifferent to the struggles of the small, stubborn species who had fought so hard simply to survive long enough to build something better than endless war. I intended to make sure that whatever came next, humanity would remain ready for it. But for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I also allowed myself, quietly, carefully, to hope that readiness alone might not always be what the future required. Sometimes, it seemed, peace could be real after all. It simply had to be earned, and then protected, one careful, honest day at a time.